Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast, brought to you by FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by Jackie Augustine. Summer is grinding forward. It doesn't look like summer outside right now. It's raining, it's ugly, it's gray, but it's August, so we can't really complain. It's like 80 degrees. Man, so much news in the last 2 weeks, right, Jackie? It's
yes,
crazy.
There's been a lot of stuff that's happened since we were last here.
So, and it has been a few weeks since we were last here. And of course, politics doesn't stop even in the summer. That was the one thing that we were sort of talking about before we went on air. I think the last time we were here, a lot of people sort of start to tune out during the summer. They've got vacations, they've got stuff going on, they've got, family over, whatever the case may be. And it's easy to sort of forget about the board meetings that are still happening, forget about the political news because, election season's coming up and we don't really want to start to think about that, but it's closer than we like to think, right?
Yeah.
But lots of news, especially in Geneva. We finally have some real concrete answers on issues and stories that we've been talking about since last Christmas.
I know. I mean, the last time we were here, we were talking about the city manager search, and that has since wrapped up and come to a very good conclusion. So City Council, it appears, finally saw the light and went ahead and hired Sage Gerling. So at the last council meeting, beginning of August, she accepted the position, and they had kind of a little swearing-in ceremony, which was really great because the crowd wasn't as large as it has been for some meetings past. I think, again, owing to the fact that it is summertime.
It's summer.
And not everybody's going to come out on a hot Wednesday night to sit at the police station and watch a city council meeting. So, but it was nice because her family was there, and her kids were able to go up front, and it just had a very wholesome feel to it. I don't know. I was just happy to see it. I feel like the city's in good hands, and that's great. And they were talking about the comptroller, Adam Blowers, who's been part of the management team. That team is going to continue, Adam, Doris, and Sage, into September to kind of transition as Sage kind of assumes the city manager role. And then I guess Adam will be transitioning into an assistant city manager role. So it's really funny because the first time we talked about this, I said I thought it would be ideal if they could just leave that team in place, but they would never do it. And, I understand that Doris is going to be retiring, so she's kind of moving on from the city. But it looks like, 2 out of 3 are going to stay, and I think that's really exciting. It's good.
So the question that I had as I listened to the news, obviously it's great that Sage got the position, won the fight, I guess you could say, or those who were fighting for her to get it won the fight. What does that mean for the city now moving forward? Because to me, it seems like there was so much frustration, disappointment with the way the process played out that I feel like just by making this single decision and giving the position to her doesn't necessarily wipe clean the slate, right? It can't.
Well, no, I don't think that. I don't think the community is simple-minded enough to think that getting the right outcome means that you can overlook a bad process, right? So I think that while people are really happy that Sage ultimately got the position, I do think that there's still a good conversation to be had about how the process went off the rails and how it could have been done differently. I mean, frankly, had the residents of the community not shed light on what was going on, this probably would have gone a very different way. I mean, just hearing from, some of the discussion that has been happening in the community about who the other finalists were. Clearly, there was a divide on City Council between what they were really looking for. At the end of the day, they made the right decision. But if it were me, this would be the right time for city council to actually write a little memo to a future city council saying, here's what we thought we were doing when we started this process. Here's what actually happened and what went wrong. So next time we need to hire a city manager sometime in the far distant future, these are the kind of things you might avoid. I mean, doing that kind of postmortem assessment of any process, I think is good practice. People rarely do it. Like they think, well, we'll do something different next time. But when next time comes around, you forgot what happened. So really, after something like that, you should be making notes about what needs to change the next time.
Yeah, and I think that point sort of reinforces one of the things we've talked about before, which is just there needs to be a better method for keeping track of what and how and where on any legislative body, whether it's small, regional, large, whatever the case may be. There needs to be a good process for retaining what had happened before, how the process, what didn't work, what did work, because what you're talking about, you say in the far distant future, could literally happen in 3 years if there's a bunch of new faces on city council.
Right.
I mean, that's how quickly information can just be sort of lost in the shuffle, and that's why I think it is very interesting. Some cities, and I believe Canandaigua recently redid their charter last year. They had gone through some changes or attempted to make some changes to their charter to stagger the way elections fell on certain council seats. That way you never had this swift turnover of councilors in one swoop, which can cause that kind of sort of loss of institutional knowledge.
Yes. And well, it's really funny that you mentioned that, because city council at the same meeting also decided to kind of reconfigure the Board of Ethical Review to add a couple of members, which is great because they only had 3 members, which means if somebody has to recuse themselves or misses a meeting, what do? I mean, you potentially have a tie, I guess. So they've increased the number of members, but they also, Councilor D'Amico piped up and said, well, maybe we should stagger the terms so that people aren't leaving all at the same time. And I wanted to applaud. I mean, that's great. I think city council ought to do the same thing for themselves. I think that they need to understand that when you lose institutional memory, you end up spending a lot of time on stuff that you could have. I mean, that reminds me, like, for instance, they were going to debate this, like, sign ordinance, and I wasn't planning on speaking, but I got back up to the podium, and I was like, wait a second, like, we already talked about this, and there's actually case law about this, so nobody remembers? Like, there were people that were on council before, but they didn't remember. So, yeah, I think when issues come up, it's trying to figure out what are you going to do differently the next time so that you're always learning and always getting better. And it's never going to be perfect, but if you want it to be better, then it does require a little bit of effort.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. It kind of goes back to this point that I've talked about with some of my friends before who get frustrated with politics, because if not for meeting minutes, there is no other way of actually tracking the data and information.
Right.
And if you're on a board that passes 15 resolutions in one session, what are you remembering? What are you going to remember from that? A month and a half from now, 2 months from now, 2 years from now? There just needs to be a better, more modern way to keep track and to collect the data and have it in organized in a way that makes sense, not just for them, but for the taxpayers and everyone else who's involved. But the question I have now is, so we're through the process. Sage Gerling is the city manager for the city of Geneva. Looking back, what if there's one thing, because I tried to sort of do this myself, I was like, what is the one thing you would change going back through that whole process? If you were going to change or pinpoint one thing that could have just made the entire thing, with this being the outcome, a whole lot more peaceful for everyone involved.
Communication. I mean, it's the same theme. Council is not a fiefdom. It is not a little kingdom unto itself. City councilors are elected by and are representatives of the greater public. And anytime they set on a course to cut out the public, they make a mistake. And it's not that I'm not saying every member of the city needed to be polled about who should be the city manager, because I don't believe that's it either. The reason we have representative democracy is because not everybody has time to get all the information to make these kind of decisions.
Right.
But communicating what the intention is, what the skill set is, what the geographic reach might be, how you intend to proceed, and then updating that along the way and allowing people to comment and check that and say, well, wait a second, no, we don't think somebody who comes from the exact same city profile is what we need. We are looking for success in these areas, or we're looking for these personality traits, these types of recommendation statements or something. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I don't presume to know the best way to go about it. All I know is that everything is better when people are open and talking about stuff, and that has been the theme of this city council since they took office, which is that they have a closed-door governing policy, and that doesn't work. It will always catch up. So why not just do it right the first time?
Yeah, so I think the takeaway for me after going through or watching that entire process play out, I think, is just we're at this crossroads where you have the digital age, access to information, everything is just right there at our fingertips 24/7. But then you have this coming from the other direction, these boards that are always operating behind personnel matter or a personnel matter,
right?
Which is obviously you can file that under we will go into executive session matter. To me, it seems that government needs to modernize to the extent that there needs to be some concessions, and I think that's what you're sort of referencing or getting toward. There needs to be some concessions so that the information that people want can be made available so that the process still feels inclusive.
Yeah.
Because this process might have felt inclusive 30 years ago, that the one that the city just went through. And I realize that government moves slowly and regulation moves slowly right along with it. But at the same time, things have sped up and become so much more data and information and access driven in the last 15 years that there just has to be something that drags that process forward,
right,
and gets everyone to a place where, yes, the personalities and the people and the parts of it that should be kept confidential are kept confidential, but the other parts that really are just, I guess, kept confidential because they are.
Right.
It doesn't really matter. Some of the information, I say this because some of the information that I'll use the Geneva Believer as an example, some of the information that they were fighting to get to put out there in the public realm would have done no harm to the Geneva population at large.
That's
or
right.
City council if it were just made public.
Right.
Some of it would have caused some residents to ask questions. But beyond that, genders, things
right.
like that,
yep.
Race, all of these things are immaterial in the process itself. So let that information be out there.
Right.
If you're confident in the process, you're not using the process itself as a shield.
Yes.
Put that information out there and let it be. Let the public come to their own conclusion about it.
That's exactly right. And I think that that's right. It just makes me think of Bob Freeman, who is the director of the New York State Committee on Open Government. He always has this phrase, which I'm going to botch, so I apologize in advance. But basically, what it gets down to is that executive session provisions are there for very limited circumstances, and they're really meant to protect, like when you're talking about personnel, they're meant to protect an individual from being, unduly kind of dragged through the coals if they don't need to be. It is not there to protect the governing body from answering questions. Right. It is not there to protect people from seeing why they're doing what they're doing. But that's what it's used for most of the time. And that was the situation here. They cloaked it under personnel. They had these weird things where they told people they could only, send written stuff. They couldn't send emails. I mean, overtly trying to get around any documents that could be foiled or open meetings laws. That is sketchy. Like by any... And so why do that? Why... if you're really trying to be on the up and up, then don't be sketchy. That
seems to be.
It seems simple, right?
Yeah. So another process that did seem to go a little smoother and a little simpler. The police chief.
Yes.
Geneva has a new police chief, right?
Yep. And the process for that, luckily, because this is
driven by civil service.
Yes, it's a civil service filing, and it's great because this is one of those situations where, sometimes people complain that a civil service process locks you in and doesn't let you consider other factors. This is a situation where the process yielded the best outcome, so that's like a win-win for everybody. And speaking about, transparency and openness and engaging the public, my hope, and this is what I wrote my column about, my hope is that this new Chief Paslakwa, will embrace the idea that the police force is not a private security force that the city government contracts with. The police force is part and parcel of the community. And that means there's certain protocol for how things are done. And you've got to allow the public to be part of that. I mean, if we have community standards, which we do, then the community is part of keeping watch over those. I'm not saying that what we need is to deputize everybody in the community. What I'm saying is, if there is this kind of independent review board that just says, okay, anytime there's a complaint against the police, we'll take a look at it, we'll compare it against our community standards about the training and expectations, and then we'll make a recommendation about what should happen. That not only bolsters confidence in policing in general, but it keeps the community engaged in a way that the police need. I mean, they can't do their job alone. They need community partners. They need people to trust them and respect them and participate with them in keeping people safe.
It's a process.
Yeah. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that, again, learning from the lessons of the past of what hasn't worked, that there will be, the ability to try what could work, what works other places, and what I think could really work in Geneva.
So my genuine curiosity is, how confident is the city or the population of the city in this choice? Is there sort of that community-wide, this was the best outcome? Or is there still that 50-50 or whatever you want to call it, 30-80 split or 30-70 split that's creating this sort of dynamic that might make it difficult for the police force in the next year, 2 years?
I don't know. I don't know how to break out that percentage, because have I heard from what I might consider to be a more traditional crowd that they would have liked a different selection? Sure. But by and large, I think people who have been showing up to things, staying engaged in stuff, who really care not so much about personalities as they do about process and about, how is the community thriving as a whole instead of how are my personal interests being met. I think by and large, anybody who is community-minded is really excited. But I do think that, Geneva, like any place, you've got some people who see the community as theirs to benefit them as they see fit, and then you've got people who think we're all in it together. So there's always going to be that mix. I would love to think that it's trending more, that Geneva's trending more towards people who want to collaboratively participate in being a city. But it's not 100%, that's for sure.
A lot of work. I just think that the speed at which the process played out seemed much more fitting to not allowing a lot of, I don't want to say time for people to get concerned about what interests or whose interests were being most closely paid attention to.
Right.
But that seems to be the way it trends. If the process takes longer, you start to ask more questions about, wait, what's really happening here?
Right.
With it happening more quickly, I feel like you get to a place where less uncertainty around policing now. Most people seem to be more content with the way things are going. Hopefully they can start to go down that checklist and, accomplish some of the things that, my God, folks in Geneva have been talking about for 2, 3, 4 years now.
Yeah.
I mean, and now's the time. This is really probably the best opportunity that the police force has had, right, in the last 20 years to do something like this.
I agree. And, some people, I think, are saying, well, let's look at the community compact and kind of do what was recommended there. And while I agree that the community compact is an important document, the community compact was written when the expectations of the community were here, based on how things were. The expectations of the community have increased as far as what might be possible and what a healthy community policing relationship might look like. And I think that we shouldn't sell ourselves short by just sticking to kind of the I would say the lower expectations of the community compact. I think we can reach a little higher and say, in the intervening years since that was first started, we have seen some possibilities for more growth, more opportunity, better protocols and procedures. Let's go for that. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested to see how this is going to go now that we've got change in leadership in both places. So
obviously we don't just talk about Geneva on this program. Seneca Falls has also been a frequent flyer. The Koch building, the Huntington building as it's called, has been subject to this really bizarre process. So Circle K, a company that owns 2 gas stations in Seneca Falls on 5 and 20, want to expand and create essentially a one-stop shop on the corner where this building sits. The building, some historical preservation folks are saying, whoa, pump the brakes. This is a historical building. We need to do something meaningful with this. We need to figure out a way to repurpose it, et cetera, et cetera. The Historical Preservation Committee, similar to a planning board, Seneca Falls has this too, is one of the ladders, one of the rungs on the overall ladder to get a project like this across the finish line. They held off on a vote, which would have happened last month, which was an appeal to a decision made earlier in the spring to not allow the building to be wrecked down so that to pave the way for this larger convenience store / gas station. It set off this really interesting debate. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it today was because the more I thought about it, and I was thinking of you the entire time I'm writing my last column in Finger Lakes Times, because I'm thinking about the people in Seneca Falls and the people who live in the former village who don't have transportation, who don't have an actual grocery store anymore. And because of the proximity of our office to that gas station, I'm there 5 to 8, maybe 10 times a week, picking up whatever the case may be, because it's a closer drive than it is to going to Walmart or Tops or wherever you may go. And I started thinking about the access problem that by blocking this project in the way that it was framed is the thing that no one's talking about, and it's driving me crazy because I'm saying to myself, wait a second. Most people in the village haven't seen a grocery store in 10 years now, an actual grocery store in the village. And it isn't a secret that Seneca County's population of impoverished / not driving / not stably housed individuals is growing. It's not shrinking.
Right.
And it seems to be that, and this is my concern with government as a whole, that you have this shrinking number of folks who are decision makers on these planning boards, these committees in government. And these folks are increasingly the upper third, we'll call it, of the population on the socioeconomic side. So what kind of decisions are they making? Are they making the best decisions for the town, for the residents? Right. Or are they making the best decisions to preserve something that they sort of remember fondly from their childhood? Now, I am approaching 30 years old, and in my lifetime, that building has looked exactly the way it looks right now. It has looked, frankly, terrible. And I have listened to folks much older than me talk for years and years and years about all of these grants and all of this money and all of these economic development tools that exist out there to rehab these old structures and make them look great. And we are actually housed in a building that a lot of development happened. It was the original Miners Academy High School. It took a lot of money, but personal investment from a pair of individuals from Geneva to make a reality. This pipe dream that grants are going to be the savior and that building is going to be preserved, that doesn't happen without interest, without someone who says, I want to do that. And here you have a company who is saying, hey, we're ready to rock and roll. Give us the green light. We'll take care of it. And you'll have a much better, safer, accessible corner store for the former village of Seneca Falls. And it boggles my mind, because it's something that in a place like Geneva or in a place like, even some of the, I don't want to call them larger cities, but the larger villages / community towns that are more densely populated, where they have more gas stations, where they have more of these little convenience stores, you don't have that same kind of problem. This is literally it. There's one other convenience store in Seneca Falls on Fall Street. Everything else, it's in Waterloo practically. So it really gets to a point now where, denying the appeal, denying the opportunity for something to happen on that corner is absolutely begging for a repeat of what we've seen play out time and time again. Seneca Falls, as I said before, has countless buildings that have been there much longer than I have been in Seneca Falls. And they've looked the same for my entire life. They've been empty, they've been unused. Maybe these grants have existed for less time than that, but either way, there clearly isn't this interest to jump into business locally, so what is it? What are we going to do? Are we going to say, no, we don't really want that kind of business? And I also am asking this question: if it weren't Circle K, based in, I believe, Akron, Ohio, or a city in Ohio, if it were Ma and Pop of Seneca Falls who wanted to do the exact same project, how would that be received? I think the outcome would be decidedly different, and I think those same folks would be rolling out the red carpet for those people to knock that building down, which, by the way, as some engineers who have done some study and looking at that site, there was a fourth floor on that building, and when they removed the fourth floor, apparently it lost much of its historical value. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then what are you preserving?
All right.
There's a lot
there. There is a lot there. I think it's probably no secret that I tend to favor historic preservation, because I feel that what we've seen in other communities is that people want to visit a place, right? They don't want to visit a line of strip malls that they can see anywhere. They want a place. Now, that being said, not every old building is a building of historic character and merit that needs to be protected at all costs. So there's that. So again, I think in all of these situations, there needs to be these nuanced discussions about what are we really talking about, right? So I don't know Seneca Falls Historic Commission. I mean, Geneva has a Historic Districts Commission. There are historic districts, downtown, Genesee Park, an area by South Main and Pulteney Street, where that have higher protections. And then there are individually listed buildings that have more protection. That's the issue with Parrott Hall, right? Parrott Hall has been empty for a long time, but it was Geneva's first building listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and that is a significant designation. So not every old building is equal, I guess, in terms of protection. Now you've raised this question in terms of access. I totally agree people need access to food. I don't agree convenience stores are the best way to do it, but I also understand that in some communities, having some access to something is better than having access to nothing, although that itself is its own calculation, because flooding a market with Twinkies, not to pick on Twinkies, I like Twinkies, but, might not be a net benefit than not having access to Twinkies at all, right? So I think there is an access question about what is the need that needs to be served. Is this going to have a fresh food section? Is there a point of negotiation about what's offered, like
there
what
already
they can
is.
adopt?
You can walk into Nice and Easy now, and there's basically a shelf, a twisting shelf with bananas, oranges, and apples on it. It's funny because if you go in there, you see the void it's filling just by what's in there compared to what was in there 10 or 15 years ago, when it was just a simple convenience store.
Right.
And what they're building or modeling towards or trying to build is something to fill that void.
Right. And so I think then that becomes that part of the discussion. Like, now we have a food access issue. Is that our prevailing community interest? You've got to have people that are able to weigh those and have a discussion about what actually makes sense. The out-of-town thing, I don't think should get as much weight. I mean, yes, we would always prefer that all our development is done locally by people who care about the community, but I can tell you there are local people who will develop stuff that don't care about the community at all, and there are national or international or just somehow more remote developers who will care a lot. So there's a question of business practice as well. But I think Geneva's running into a similar issue as it relates to the reuse of the Trinity Church on South Main Street. If you don't have an engaged and knowledgeable board willing to have these discussions and instead just more worried about kind of covering their tracks and making sure that they're just following the letter of the law and they're not really talking about community need in a really robust way, that's how you end up with a bunch of bad decisions. So,
and I think it's even scaling back a little bit from that. I don't want to discredit or credit anybody at this point. I think the problem that even smaller communities than Geneva, like Seneca Falls, run into is having boards filled with individuals who, frankly, aren't aware enough to even care if they're covering their tracks appropriately. I think the assumption is just that they are, because what we're doing isn't that big a deal, that kind of approach. But it's creating that sort of that gatekeeper attitude that
right.
just it seems to be. I don't want to sit here and ramble on about inclusion, but just come on, you have to look at it when you have an opportunity to very quickly, swiftly, cleanly get a project across the finish line. There has to be a desire to get it across the finish line.
Right.
And you have to. I feel like these boards need to be filled with people who at least see that. And say, you know what? Sure, we're going to lose one building that has historical value in Seneca Falls, but there are plenty of others. If these folks come out of the woodwork who want to work with and develop businesses within these historic structures, we can show them all of the great places we already have. But this one, someone already came. There's already been discussion. If not for a car dealership, it would have been vacant for the last 30 years, undoubtedly. It's just a really bizarre set of circumstances. It seems manufactured in terms of creating conflict that just really shouldn't even be there. Should be a
no-brainer. Well, it will be interesting to see how this might dovetail with the DRI stuff, because those announcements should be coming out pretty soon, right, for our region.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't mean that to be a segue into talking about Auburn, but it kind of is.
We can, though.
But, it'll be interesting because part of what the DRI process is supposed to do, and frankly, I don't think communities need to wait till they get $10 million to do something like this, is to try and figure out what are those priorities and how do we rank them so that we'll know when a project comes forward. We won't have to reinvent the wheel of trying to figure out what we should talk about and what we shouldn't. We will have a rubric to say, okay, this either fits our objectives or it doesn't. And we don't have to spend a lot of time getting into the weeds trying to figure out what we really think about stuff. It's about having a system. It's about having a process. And then, not that I'm a huge fan of developers, because look, they're making a hefty profit. So if they have to wait a couple months, so be it. But I will say, in fairness to the development community, they should have some predictability too. They should know when I come into a community, if I put together a decent project, I shouldn't have a bunch of arbitrary roadblocks. And that, I think, is the issue, the arbitrariness, right?
Yep.
So I think it's incumbent on communities to get clear what their priorities and their needs are, so that when a project presents itself, they aren't deadlocked and unable to make any decision.
Mm-hmm. Now, segueing into the Auburn winning their $10 million, obviously a huge deal for them. Mm-hmm. But the question now, I think, is the DRI losing impact? First year, it was like, wow, $10 million, that's a big deal. Second year is like, yeah, that's cool, like $10 million. Now I feel like it's gotten to a point where it's almost, and you can actually go through and see if you're watching the stats on some of the stories that have been published about it. There is this sort of downtrend with the news. It's like, oh, another community got $10 million. Okay. And frankly, I'm also getting to the point where I'm asking myself, how many more communities are legitimately in the running?
Right. I do wonder about that. I mean, I think Geneva is due to get a second. I mean, if they're going to do another round, I can't imagine many communities being more competitive than the kind of stuff Geneva could continue doing.
Yeah.
So go Geneva. But
I feel like, you look at the map and you start to sort of pick out the communities. Newark is a finalist right now. Seneca Falls is a finalist. Penn Yan, I believe, was a finalist last year, or they might be a finalist this year, maybe, because there wasn't a definitive list. Auburn has gotten it. Watkins Glen got it. Cortland got it. Who's left? Canandaigua?
Well, in my opinion, Canandaigua doesn't deserve it, so I hope they don't get one. We had this discussion before, because originally I was like, yeah, Seneca Falls makes sense, but then through our discussion, you're right. I mean, I'm now pulling for Newark. I hope it's Newark.
But even if not this year,
right? But then that means,
it's only a matter of time. Like
the
next
other
year or
one
the
gets
year after, they have to, because who else?
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. Come back to Geneva. But yeah, I still think the program as a concept is really interesting, because even if a community doesn't get funded, right, the kind of creativity that would go in. Now, I'm only speaking from the perspective of Geneva's proposal, because I haven't really seen how the other communities have developed their proposals, but I think back to Geneva's proposal, and I think the kind of cross-community outreach that went into just pitching Geneva is great. That's like a pride booster. That kind of stuff should be happening on an ongoing basis anyway. But I think in each round, they're kind of fine-tuning the process by which they distribute the funds. And what I hope is that if there is another round, if this keeps going, that they would require communities to get a little more creative than we've seen to date. So, and this is kind of what I was wondering with Auburn. I was kind of looking at their announcement, and they've got they had some urban renewal in downtown. They've got to figure out what their downtown core is and what they're going to do. Here's the problem. So in Geneva, when you're talking about downtown buildings, I think there was a real opportunity to put that money into a very innovative program, which would have done some of the stuff the comprehensive plan recommends, this 485B legislation, which would allow, it's a different financing and taxation mechanism when you're improving a historic building or a downtown building. That could have been really useful. What ended up happening is they have these community forums. People sort themselves into the issues they're most interested in. So no surprise, the building owners got themselves into the downtown building group. And they essentially turned it into a which building deserves money over another building in terms of whether it's historic, what the use is going to be. And there was very little discussion of cooperating for an elevator tower that could serve several buildings, or for it became very territorial. So I think if Auburn makes the same mistake in that regard, because you think now, I mean, even now, there are downtown building owners who received a DRI grant who still are not satisfied and think the program was terrible. That I want to say to those building owners, the outcome is what it is because of your participation in the process. Had you been more creative and more open, you might have been happier. Mm-hmm. But people get a little short-sighted. They see their dollars and cents and they want their dollars. So I'm hoping Auburn maybe will take a lesson from Geneva and not just pick certain buildings and give developers the funds to just rehab them and get them back on board, but will instead look at what do these buildings need collectively and how could we have the best collective impact with these funds. But we'll see.
All right. Well, that's, and staying right in the Seneca Falls theme, there was a story or a series of stories, I guess, that I just wanted to quickly touch on.
Okay.
Supervisor Lazaro was granted a conditional discharge for his harassment case involving a family member. The question was thrown at us a few different times, or I should say thrown at us as in fingerlakes1.com.
Okay.
Why we didn't cover his court case more thoroughly. Why didn't we cover the outcome more thoroughly? I just wanted to address it. We typically do not cover court action for many reasons, but mainly because unless it's a felony case, a major felony case that is going to be having a wide interest across the Finger Lakes, or is just so severe that it requires coverage, we will not, because of the manpower that it takes to do so. We have to serve a regional community that far dwarfs Seneca Falls. Seneca Falls has a population of roughly 7,000. We are serving every single community between Rochester, Syracuse, Lake Ontario, and Ithaca, and then going all the way into Steuben County. So just understanding the scope of that, if we covered the court action of every misdemeanor case, and I understand some folks are going to say, well, he's an elected official. Go back through the archives in Finger Lakes 1. There have been countless elected officials in Schuyler County, Steuben County, Yates County, who have had court action, Ontario County, who have had court action of their own on misdemeanor cases, and we have handled it the exact same way. It's just one of those scenarios where if we had court staff that were going to go out and report on nothing but court action, that would be one thing. But the trends just don't dictate that. And, fortunately enough, we are very happy with the way our coverage is going, and most of our readers are as well. So I just wanted to say that. As far as the conditional discharge itself, honestly, I don't think it's that big a deal. These types of things happen every day, and I realize that he's an elected official, but if you are being critical of Supervisor Lazaro at this point because of this, I'm sure you can find about 36 other reasons to be critical of him that are just as legit and carry much more weight in his day-to-day activity and role as town supervisor. And I'm also going to say this. The community, I think, at large has missed the boat as far as if there were going to be an opportunity to do something or to voice overall opposition to his role as supervisor, maybe in an effort to get him to resign or something to that effect, it's the opportunity's been missed. New elections coming up next year. Move on. If you really want to, make Seneca Falls better, and you're living in Seneca Falls right now, my advice would be find a candidate who wants to run and who genuinely cares about Seneca Falls and fits the ideals that you carry, so that you have someone you can be confident in moving forward after this 4-year term is up. It's really important. I think, we've seen the ups and downs of how many folks are turning out to town board meetings. It tends to be the same, even on a good day, the same 40 to 60 people. That's not an engaged community. It just isn't. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. Is there anything you'd like to add to this whole story? Obviously, the Finger Lakes Times was doing a great job of covering the whole thing. They kept the community informed, and super grateful to that.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I think it ties into the next, these are kind of coupled together, right? So the issue in Canandaigua last week of Senator Pam Helming's chief of staff speeding and texting or being on the phone and, pretty critically injuring a cyclist. I think that there's an ongoing discussion about what kind of people we want in public office. And everybody's going to come down different spot on that, right? Nobody's perfect, so we're all asking ourselves, what do we think we can tolerate and what's out of bounds, right? And I tend to be more strict in that. Other people are not, and that is a legitimate point of disagreement. People will elect who they feel confident in. I think the thing that ties these two together, which I hope, which now I guess goes back, has become a theme I didn't even realize, is this communication piece. So I do think public officials, whether elected or hired, being a primary representative. I mean, your chief of staff is the person that, for example, if you write a column that involves the senator, that might be the person who calls you to discuss it, right? So the voice of the office. I do think that elected officials and appointed officials have a responsibility to address these issues, right? I'm not making a judgment about what the correct action is in terms of as it relates to their office, but I do think if someone is caught doing something like this, they do have an obligation to step forward and say, hey, either this does or this does not relate to my job performance. And here is my case for either staying in office or leaving. And I just think that that's integrity, right? That's how you address an issue. If there's a question mark in somebody's mind about how you've been conducting yourself, you should address it and just...
It certainly seems like the way you keep it from snowballing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. If you want to appeal just to somebody's self-interest, don't hide about it. That will make it worse. The cover-up's worse than the crime, right? We've learned that over and over and over again. But I just think, people you might give your explanation and someone might say, well, I then think you should not be there. And you say, well, I think I am going to stay. Okay, then you've had a meeting of the minds that you've had a discussion that you don't have a meeting of the minds, but at least there's been the respect of addressing it publicly and saying something about it. I just think in general, any public official should not hide when there is a question mark.
I agree with this particular story. I'm not even sure I'd fall into a camp of those who might think maybe he needs to be removed from his role. He is not an elected official. He is just someone who works in the office. It's this really fine line. And do I think that he needs to be held accountable for what he did? Absolutely. But at the same time, I think, one of my pet peeves about politics is when something like this happens, the next legislative session, we tend to see some sort of piece of policy that could possibly tie to it and sort of put a cherry on top of an otherwise terrible set of circumstances. I know in Rochester there's been a lot of discussion about safety of bicyclists and how much access or piece of the road they have compared to motorists. I think that the state as a whole is primed for legislation legislation on that front. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were this time around, but if that legislation were sponsored or co-sponsored or somehow endorsed by Senator Helming, I think it would, at the same time, if she didn't come out and, outline how she handled this issue internally, create some questions from those who might just be casual spectators of politics, even if it is completely well-intended.
Right, or at least saying, this was not conduct that we would have hoped for, and this is, how we feel about it. But I just think in general, silence from government officials at any level is to be avoided. It's a bad thing.
Yeah. So our last topic for the day, and obviously we'll be talking about this one more in the future, since it's going to be a lengthy process, they say. And that was pretty much the only news that came out of that story as it popped up. Hobart and William Smith colleges will be taking their time in seeking out their next president. I laughed because it kind of sounded similar to the way City Council was talking about the city manager search when that first started. Good on them, I guess. I feel like they have a lot of holes to fill right now. I feel like while the institution is moving forward and things are going just fine, I feel like they have a lot of administrative holes to fill to get that sort of confidence or the swagger that the colleges might have had back 5, 10, 15 years ago back. Because it seems like since the prior year in administration, things have kind of gone the wrong direction, at least on the community outreach side, the PR side of it.
Yeah, I think that I don't have much to say about their search process. I think it's good, again, that they're communicating, here's where we're at, here's an update, here's what you can expect. That's good. I think that's modeling good communication behavior. But I agree with you that the board, you were talking about holes to fill. I really think what ends up happening then is it falls back on the board in the same way that it would have fallen back on the city council had they taken this a little more seriously. To say, these are our top priorities. This is the work that is paramount. These are the things that must be accomplished. And we are going to tailor our search process to make sure that there is no question that these are our priorities, so that all the candidates are going to know, don't bother applying if these aren't your priorities, and all the finalists, the community, the college community in this standpoint, will feel assured, whoever the finalists are, we know at least they have these stated priorities. So I think the colleges have a great opportunity to do exactly the opposite of what the city did. I'm hoping that for both processes, the outcome will be just as good, because it's great. We ended up with SAGE, despite all odds with the process they put together.
Against all odds.
Yeah, and I hope that HWS ends up with an excellent president by doing things the right way from the get-go, which it appears that they're doing.
So, stories of the week. Anything that you're watching, in particular in the news that we haven't talked about today?
Of course, I feel like we've talked about a lot of stuff.
Been so much going on. For me, I just want to throw a quick note out there. FingerLakes1.com/waterfront. Everyone knows Peter Manius and his reporting. It's now on FingerLakes1.com. He's working with us, and every single story that has been published before and will be published moving forward on his blog will be on FO1. Check it out. It's one of the rare places it's pretty rare in this region, despite how environmentally forward we are. It's kind of difficult to find solid reporting, and it's exactly what he provides. Solid,
his
unbiased
work is
reporting,
excellent.
Decades of experience, just it's second to none. So really happy to have that on board here. But that's the story that I'm watching because it's HAB season. Hello.
Yeah.
We're here.
Yep. Well, and I think that what I'm watching is the Seneca Falls Town Board discussion regarding the landfill and the permit. Because, again, now's the time, right, for people who care about these issues to attend these meetings and find out, even if a host agreement it is going to go forward, even if a permit is still going to be allowed, the community can always request and demand more protective measures than currently exist. So there's always, I don't fall into this thing of it's either approve or deny. Sure, I'd love to deny it, but if it can't be denied, there are stages of approval. There are conditions on approval. So I think the community just needs to stay on top of that and pay attention and ask elected officials to be making those demands to protect the community.
All right. Well, that's it. That's all she wrote. We did it. That's going to do it for this week's show. Thanks for our listeners and FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Let us know what's on your mind. Drop us a line at debrief@FingerLakes1.com. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. Stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we will catch you next time.